Welcome back, focused learners. I am seriously fascinated by today's explainer. We're taking a deep dive into the hidden systemic damage caused by diabetes. We're going to unpack a groundbreaking review article from the journal Signal Transduction and Targeted Therapy and visualize exactly how diabetes essentially attacks the body's internal highways.
So think about this for a second. Why does a disease defined simply by elevated blood sugar lead to such catastrophic outcomes? We're talking heart attacks, blindness, amputations. For the longest time, the gap between, just having simple high blood glucose and total organ failure has felt like a massive mystery. Well, today we're going to bridge that knowledge gap.
All right, let's dive right into this. Our roadmap for today's explainer covers 5 quick sections: the panvascular network, the cellular chain reaction, organs in the crosshairs, the domino effect, and finally, the future of care.
Starting off with Section 1, the panvascular network, which is essentially the body's interconnected highway.
The source introduces this really massive paradigm shift. It wants us to view the human body as a single connected vessel tree. And this leads us to Diabetic Panvascular Disease, or DPD. Historically, medicine has kind of treated a diabetic heart attack in one department and then diabetic kidney failure over in another. But DPD is a clinical syndrome where atherosclerosis and microvascular damage happen simultaneously. They're hitting the heart, brain, kidneys, eyes, and limbs all at once. We absolutely have to stop viewing these diabetic complications as separate, isolated diseases. It is one systemic attack. To make this easier, picture it like this. Think of macroangiopathy as damage to your major highways, your large arteries. Because the blood flow there is really fast and turbulent, these highways are super prone to atherosclerosis, or plaque buildup. On the flip side, microangiopathy affects the local roads, your tiny capillaries. Blood flow here is much calmer, sure, but the vessels are incredibly vulnerable to endothelial damage, which is basically the destruction of their super delicate inner lining.
Moving right along to Section 2, the cellular chain reaction. We're looking at the villains in the bloodstream. Let's zoom way in to the microscopic level. The source outlines this unification hypothesis that links all of this damage back to one culprit: excessive glucose flux. Here's how it plays out. Step 1, high glucose physically overloads your cells. Step 2, this overload panics the cells and forces them into abnormal metabolism, which triggers these alternative channels like the polyol and hexosamine pathways. Step 3, these weird alternate pathways start churning out some pretty nasty byproducts, which I'll define in just a sec, and that leads to massive oxidative stress. And finally, step 4, this stress completely disrupts the endothelial vessel barrier. The local roads literally begin to crack.
So what exactly are those harmful byproducts I just mentioned? We're talking about advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, and reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Picture these guys as molecular villains that act exactly like rust building up inside your biological pipes. They bind to proteins, they stiffen up the blood vessels, and they trigger severe inflammation. They are the actual underlying mechanism causing all that oxidative stress that tears your vascular network apart.
Now, this part is just wild. It's this concept of hyperglycemic memory. The source data reveals that even if a patient gets their blood sugar back down to perfectly normal levels, the blood vessels literally remember the damage. Actually, it's due to epigenetic changes, like physical shifts in how the cells express their genes. Because of that, they stay in a state of oxidative stress. This right here is exactly why early intervention is so absolutely critical. You can't just fix the sugar later and expect the rust to magically disappear, because the pipes remember. Okay, on to section 3, organs in the crosshairs. Let's look at where this damage actually hits. Because different organs have completely different energy needs, this system-wide rust impacts them uniquely. It's the exact same underlying disease, but it manifests differently depending on where you look. In the heart, which obviously demands massive amounts of energy, cells get overloaded with fatty acids, and that leads to cardiomyopathy. Over in the brain, those molecular villains breach the blood-brain barrier, exposing neurons to toxins and causing cognitive impairment. And in the kidneys, the tiny ultrafiltration systems just get blown out by blood pressure and flow disturbances, leading to kidney disease. It's the same disease, but it causes 3 completely different organ failures. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. The eyes are a prime microvascular target. In diabetic retinopathy, damage causes a loss of capillary cells, which makes those tiny little vessels leaky. This triggers extreme local inflammation. And then, in a desperate attempt to fix the lack of oxygen, the eye produces something called vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF. But this just creates a chaotic, tangled network of totally fragile new vessels. Ultimately, this entire cascade can lead to macular edema, which is severe swelling in the back of the eye and even blindness.
And then we have the limbs. The source points out that diabetic peripheral vasculopathy is incredibly common, but it's often severely overlooked. The local microangiopathy in your limbs doesn't just damage the blood vessels, it literally starves the accompanying nerves. This neurovascular network is highly susceptible because the glucose overload decreases ATP, which is the basic energy currency of our cells. When the protective Schwann cells and neurons die off, the patient loses sensation. That leads to a massive risk of infections and ultimately amputations.
Which brings us to section 4, the domino effect. Let's look at the predictable timeline of all this.
What's terrifying but also incredibly useful for modern medicine is that this damage isn't just random. Researchers mapped out the chronological course of this disease using a specific diabetic mouse model. Check this out. At just week 4, peripheral motor nerve conduction already begins to slow down. By weeks 8 to 10, physical structural changes appear in the microvasculature of the kidneys and the retina. And by weeks 12 to 20, boom, advanced panvascular disease violently hits the heart and brain. So the local roads crumble first, and then the major highways collapse.
So the really crucial point here is perfectly captured in this quote straight from the source. Because those local roads crumble first, screening the microvessels in the retina can actually identify your risk of future brain and heart diseases. Think about why this matters for a second. Because the vascular system is one continuous network, a simple, non-invasive eye exam can basically act as a crystal ball. It can literally predict a future stroke or heart attack before it even happens. That is just incredible.
Finally, we've reached section 5, the future of care. This is how we're fighting back. The medical field is deploying an entirely new class of medical heroes to fight this systemic attack. Get this, there's a 39% reduction in the risk of heart failure hospitalization when diabetic patients are treated with a new class of drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors. That's a huge deal. For decades, diabetes drugs basically just lowered blood sugar. But these new treatments, they're proving to have massive, system-wide protective effects.
These modern therapeutic heroes are doing some seriously incredible work. Like we said, SGLT2 inhibitors protect the heart and kidneys by improving cellular energy metabolism. Then you've got GLP-1 agonists, which not only lower cardiovascular events, but are also showing amazing neuroprotective effects in the brain. Finerenone is a novel agent that reduces both cardiac and renal outcomes, and researchers are even actively developing aldose reductase inhibitors, which go right to the source to block that damaging polyol pathway we talked about earlier. These aren't just your standard sugar lowers, they are literally biological repair crews.
But, drugs alone just aren't enough. The authors of our source material issue a really powerful call to action here. The medical system itself must evolve. We urgently need multidisciplinary, panvascular diabetes care centers. We absolutely have to break down the silos between cardiology, nephrology, neurology, and endocrinology. The experts need to get in a room and look at the patient's entire vessel tree simultaneously, integrating their care precisely because the disease itself is integrated.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If our blood vessels are one beautifully complex, interconnected network, isn't it time we stopped treating our bodies like a collection of isolated parts? Understanding diabetic panvascular disease is the first massive step toward a much more holistic, proactive future of medicine. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today, Focus Learners. Stay curious, keep seeking out those clear explanations, and I'll see you in the next explainer.